Well, welcome to our next week on the Lives of the Saints. I hope everybody enjoyed this reading this past week. I think it's a fantastic one. There's really a lot to talk about here, and I'll just start off with the ask if anybody wants to share something from the beginning or thoughts that they had from the reading. Lives of the Saints, etc. Yeah.
Do we know anything about how the manuscript, this is somebody quoting them at length, how the manuscript was created and preserved?
I don't know the exact process, but this is probably... So the form itself is like a diary, right? It's a diary of Saint Perpetua, and then a little insert with a diary of Saturnus, I think, right? And then it's kind of surrounded by this editorial, editions of an introduction and kind of an epilogue at the end. I do know that this reading has been present since the beginning. It's really been a part of the church since the beginning. But I don't know the mechanism by which it's been conserved over so many years. So I didn't research that specifically, John.
So going way, way back, apparently there is the Latin version of this text.
Yes, I knew that, yeah.
There is a Greek version of this text. The Greek's considered to be maybe a little more authentic.
This is the Greek version.
The commentary that kind of, frames this, there's a tradition that says Tertullian is the one who actually provided that, which would be kind of interesting too. But it is considered, generally speaking, for the literary standards of the time, the genre of the time. It's about as close to a first-person account by a martyr that we have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which is really what's fantastic and interesting about the story, that most of the times there are these third-person narratives, somebody observing what's going on. And what we find in this whole story is, this is a question that we're gonna ask many times throughout. Was this martyrdom a necessary martyrdom? In other words, were Christians wildly being persecuted, rounded up, and martyred by the droves in this period of time? This is a little bit of a historical question. This is this is around 200. The answer is not really. The major persecutions of Christians didn't happen for another 50 to 100 years. So the two major martyrdom, persecutions of Christians were under the Emperor Decius in around 250, and then under Diocletian, who was the beginning of the 4th century. Before that, the Christians were kind of this weird group of people. And, they were separate in that they didn't worship the Roman gods, and they wound up, forming their own communities. And, if you're a Roman in a city or somewhere and, everybody's participating in, offering up to the gods, and then there's this community of people who don't, they're not antagonistic in any way, but that, sets this group apart. And what winds up kind of happening, this is a very brief overview, is that in the middle 3rd century, the Roman Empire really starts getting attacked from all sides, right? Before that, it's somewhat stable, but in the middle of the 3rd century is when it really starts getting attacked. And it becomes more of a empire-wide type persecution, because if the empire is getting attacked, and if things are, happening negatively, that means that we must have angered the gods. And, maybe it's because these Christians are angering the gods because they're not offering up sacrifices. Therefore, let's persecute the Christians. But again, that's much, much later. Not much, 50 to 100 years later after this story. And what's really interesting in this story is we have Perpetua and Felicitas and these other Christians that are present there. But who keeps visiting them in the prison? Deacons.
Some of the contextual stuff, it seems like it wasn't prison as we think of it, because they were having visitors, they had meals, they were doing their prayers.
Right, it's kind of this interesting, they're being prepared for this sacrifice in a way, for this game, for this festival. And Perpetua it seems to be having this conversation with the jailer, saying, you need to treat us better, because she doesn't overtly say it, but we're here because we want to be here, and because you need us in order to sacrifice something during your games. So during this whole story, there's a strong sense that they're there because they are actively seeking martyrdom. Which seems really, really weird in a way, right? Again, it's not just this big oppression that's happening, and it's not some blanket oppression that's happening to all Christians, because like it says here in several instances, they're visited by a couple of deacons and other people who are ministering to them while they are in prison. And so, all they could have done was arrest all the people that came to visited them, who had visited them, like there's all the Christians, and they would have killed them too, but they didn't.
At one point, do I recall that it said the jailer was even thought to be a Christian?
Yes.
I was like, what? Like, why would he be keeping?
Yeah, so it's a really interesting martyr story to read, and so this is what we're going to try to delve into a lot today. Yeah.
Historically, at this particular, this is around 202, 203. And there is this end-time feeling that there's a threat from the outside, so forth and so on. And so, if you were already a Christian, it's sort of like, yeah, okay, fine. But apparently there actually had been something, an edict went out, no new Christians. If you're already a Christian, okay, that's your mistake. But no conversions are going to be allowed now. And Perpetua comes from apparently a very highly placed Roman family there in Carthage. Everybody knows who they are. So that's kind of a huge advertisement for Christianity if she's going to convert. So she is in something of an unusual circumstance. A generation before, someone from that background converting, yeah, it's happening, it's fine and dandy. But once the prohibition goes into place, if the local prefect is really going to do this new edict, I can't let this happen. And if it does happen, I can't let go and punish.
Wasn't her father begging her to do a sacrifice?
Yeah, sacrifice to the emperor.
Yes.
So there evidently was a point of contention over a refusal to do it, but you're saying this was sporadic?
She was in prison before that even happened, right? She was arrested before that even happened. And it's not explicitly written here, and I forget the resource exactly, but the crux of her martyrdom is that she actively seeks to be martyred. She goes in and says, I'm a Christian, you should kill me. So that's kind of a question that I'm trying to ask and not necessarily give an answer to. With all these things, right, we have these fantastical stories, and it somehow fits into the life of the church, and we accept and live within that tension that exists in the story, right? But so we a little bit have this understanding that. And then when she's in prison, she goes through this trial, like you said. And within the context of the trial, then it's, maybe what John is talking about. That, before this, maybe they wouldn't have arrested anybody. But now she's been so blatant about it. And the governor is like, well, she's here, she's doing it. We might as well, enforce this law. But they really didn't care that much at that time about these new Christians. They weren't causing trouble. It was more just they were this weird group, and they weren't falling in line with the rest of the society. And it wasn't for that next period of time that they started blaming the Christians for all the ills that were happening in Roman society. But Kevin, did you have something?
I was going to ask how the church look at that kind of situation, but it sounds like you're not going to answer that question anymore.
I wish that I had a good answer.
Yeah.
What I would say is, and it says this somewhere in the reading, I wish I had written down the quote exactly, but as with all of the saints are for veneration, but not necessarily emulation. So a very, very important thing to remember. that in these lives, again, that we venerate and we honor and we recognize the sacrifice that's made here, but we're not all called to, give up our newborn children and then go seek out martyrdom, right? Which is what happens. And then Felicitas is a whole nother story. Well, we'll get to her. Yeah, Justin.
Well, at the risk of answering that question, I highlighted, I didn't intend to, but I ended up highlighting a bunch of stuff that said, we set forth in writing precisely that honor might be rendered to God and comfort to men by the recollection of the past through the written word.
Yes, I wrote that down too.
No one weak or sparing in faith may think that supernatural grace was present only among men of ancient times, either in the grace of martyrdom or of visions, for God always achieves what is promised. So those now learn of it through hearing may have fellowship with the holy martyrs and with the Lord Jesus Christ.
Exactly. So this is really pointing out what the purpose of the story is.
Yeah.
And I actually wrote down both of those lines that you have. The purpose for it to be written as a witness to the non-believer and a blessing to the faithful. Right? A witness to the non-believer and a blessing to the faithful. And a comfort to men by the recollection of the past through the written word. So, the story seems to be this connection. The purpose is a connection to these people who have sacrificed themselves, and to be as a witness for both people, for the martyrs, and for the faithful and those who have not believed. Because we see this time and time again in martyr stories, that what happens when somebody is martyred? Oftentimes the jailer or somebody in the crowd or somebody else runs in and is martyred on the spot as well. So to become this witness for the non-believer as well. And this is really what the early Christian community was all about, was sacrificing themselves for others. And that's what stood them apart from the whole rest of Roman society. Roman society was really, it wasn't about helping people. It was about, satisfying yourself. It was about, increasing your wealth and not about the community. And the Christian community was the opposite of this. The purpose of the Christian community was to support itself, right? I think there's historical numbers in terms of a disease spread within different communities. And it turns out that the healthiest communities were the Christian communities, because they were taking care of themselves and they were taking care of others within the communities. Whereas the Romans, they didn't care about what was happening to each other. They only cared for themselves, and they wound up dying in higher numbers. So there's historical data to support that this community was really self-supporting and able to uplift itself. And when the outside Romans looked at this, they were like, "This is something suspicious going on." I love that idea. I had these questions of why this account was written. And that's exactly what Justin pointed out. To be as a witness for, believers and non-believers alike. Yeah.
Just a big picture story of, sometimes the saints will flee, stay out of trouble, and they get caught anyway or something. And the saint, a martyr. Others, they'll go find an idol, they'll break it up, sell the pieces to the poor.
Yeah. Right.
In your face there, and as you said, and we honor them, apparently because at that time God was what God was moving through them to do. Others are saying, take your kids and let's go over here. And we may or may not become the same for different reasons.
Right. I like the variety. I've said this many times, that there is no path that you can follow, and that path is the only path that any one of us can take. And you hear several stories like this where somebody's running in and seeking martyrdom, others where they're, trying to run away, protect their family, whatever, and they wind up becoming martyred anyway, or they run away and they're not martyred and they still become saints in the church. So every single gamut of options is out there, and it's each path is a path that we can take for sanctification. And it's great. I mean, if we were all just to be martyrs like this, there'd be no more Christians left.
It's like a loving God who has lots of doors for us.
Lots and lots of doors. Yeah. And what is our job to do? What is our job?
Obey.
Obey. Really, the way I think about it is open the door that has been presented to us, right? Because there are a numerous number of doors. There's lots of doors, right? And we are each presented with a path to follow. And, for Saint Perpetua, this was the path that she was given to follow. And so we honor that.
Well, Paul said, I'm going to go to Rome. No, prophesy. This is what's going to happen to you. Yeah, I'm still going.
I'm still going to Rome.
Yeah.
So, and there's kind of, let's say, the bigger picture that we have to look at is, and she recognizes this, that by doing this, she gives hope and strength to, many other people along the way, because only 50 years later, there will be a genuine persecution that will have occurred in the church. And so for her and the others with her to provide this example, gives strength to those later on who will really undergo a genuine persecution, or a more blanket persecution, let's say. Well, great. That's a good little intro. I wanted to highlight some just things, let's say, around it, and then the structure of the story itself. Of course, when we say martyr comes from Greek word, right? Everything good comes from Greek, which means witness. So martyria means to witness to something. And these are people that are witnesses to Christ. And, to be a martyr, we oftentimes think of martyrdom as dying. And martyrdom doesn't necessarily need to be a physical death. And, the great martyrdom that most of us experience these days is marriage. The martyrdom of marriage. So to give your life for another. This is what martyrdom is. To give your life to another.
Is marriage actually considered a type of martyrdom?
100%.
Yeah.
You've been to a wedding ceremony?
No, I haven't.
You haven't. You must go. So the pinnacle of the marriage ceremony is called the service of the crowning. During the service of the crowning, we put literal crowns on the heads of the bride and the groom, and these are called Stephana. Well, who was the first martyr? Stephen. So we crown them in martyrdom, and we actually sing a hymn to the holy martyrs right after they've been crowned. So we 100% see marriage as being the crowns of martyrdom. And at the end of the service, the priest takes them and binds them together and says, accept these crowns of martyrdom into your kingdom. That's kind of how the service ends. And so that's one place. We also see it in the ordination. So during the ordination is also seen as a type of martyrdom. We sing the exact same hymns actually from the wedding at the ordination, except they're in a little bit different of an order. But we sing the exact same hymns during the ordination. So again, a different type of martyrdom. And the word Stephen means the crowned one. And we call that the crown of martyrdom. So in terms of the martyrdom, we know Stephen as being the first martyr that we read about in the Acts of the Apostles, and he kind of sets this stage for the rest of the martyrdoms as well, right? This martyrdom on his faith. He's not defensive at all. He accepts it and he forgives them and gives glory to God. So we kind of have this same process that occurs in many of the martyrdoms throughout the lives of the saints. And then, of course, immediately afterwards, we know that all of the apostles, except for John, were martyred as well, in various different ways. And then shortly thereafter, if we want to talk about a non-apostolic martyrdom, we have Ignatius. So Ignatius was a martyr that was brought, I forget where he's from, but he was brought to Rome. So he's brought to Rome and he was killed in the Colosseum in a similar way to Perpetua. And in fact, his story overlaps in a little bit in a similar way to Perpetua, in that he asked to be torn to pieces by the beasts in the Colosseum, essentially. So if you ever see an icon of Ignatius, he has two lions that are like hanging off of him. And it's great because he's perfectly at peace in the icon while this is happening to him. And so Ignatius was in the very late 1st century, early 2nd century. There's a short story on that, nothing in depth like we would read in this story. The first really big martyrdom story actually happens with Polycarp. So Polycarp was a 2nd century bishop. He died in 165. And his story is also somewhat of a parallel to Perpetua's as well. We see the same kind of thematic events in that he states that, may my martyrdom be unto the glory of God for the helping of the faithful and the non-believers. So he kind of states this at the end of his martyrdom. And it becomes one of these early, resounding stories that perpetuates within the church. And then we have the story of Perpetua and Felicitas. So along with, I would say these 3 are the earliest martyrdom stories that are really well known, that have also persisted, through the life of the church. And then Perpetua and Felicitas is this really interesting story, as John points out, as having this first-person narrative to it of the exact reasons why Perpetua is there, and kind of her final days of, the life in the prison. And so this diary, we know that this whole thing was given to us, was written at the time, right? It's the first person of Perpetua, and then the author, who is, let's say, the editor of this, he states, I knew her, right? And I was there, and I was present watching the martyrdom itself. So this is from the early 3rd century. So certainly the first first-person account, but also this, in-person account by the editor as well. So we would take the accuracy of all of this to be very, very good. Yeah. Matt, did you have a question?
No.
Or just scratching your head? Okay. Okay. Now, in the story itself, after we have the introduction and, getting into the first-person account then of Perpetua, there's some interesting kind of stylistic things that happen here. One, I would point out the extensive use of visions, right? Other than the vision sequences, everything in the story is pretty straightforward, right? There's no super fantastical things that occur other than within the vision sequences. And there's a lot. There's several of them. Perpetua has a vision that we can liken to Jacob's ladder, right? And we can also think of, if you've seen the icon of the ladder of divine ascent, on this ladder we see the saints ascending, and then the demons pulling them down with hooks, and then at the bottom is the demon trying to engorge himself on those who have fallen. And that's exactly what she describes, right? She says on either side of the ladders there's sharp instruments and swords and spears and all these other objects trying to pull, the saints off of the ladder. And we could take this, in their context as, physically these devices, but more so the passions, the distractions of the world that are trying to distract people on their, transposition into heaven. And her visions really start to, manifest themselves as reality as well, right? So she has these fantastical visions, and then part of her vision is that Saturnus dies before her and welcomes her into heaven, and then that's actually what happens in real life as well. So there are kind of these visions that she has of the kingdom of heaven, and then also the visions tie directly into the martyrdom that her and her companions would undergo. So yeah, really, really interesting. Really a kind of a unique literary device that's being used here to convey the story. And some of the other visions are really interesting. I was fascinated by the vision of her brother, if you remember that one, Dinokratis. Does anybody remember that one? It almost seemed like a little bit of an aside, but it was really, really interesting.
He had cancer of the face or whatever.
Yeah.
He described it for you.
Yep. And how old was he when he died? 7. So he was 7 when he died. And what's the vision that she has?
He's drinking from a well.
He's not drinking.
He's not drinking? Trying.
He's trying to drink. Imagine you're really thirsty,
Right.
and the top of the well's like just out of
Also
your...
at the end, where
He's like, can't reach into the water. So he's suffering. So he's died. He's apparently died as a pagan, and he's suffering. And then what happens?
She prays for it.
She prays for him, and
I saw the same spot that I had seen before, but there was Anacrates, all clean, well dressed and refreshed. I saw a scar where the wound had been.
so he was suffering, and now he's been healed. What do we do with that?
We can pray for anyone we want.
We can pray for anyone we want to. What else? His position seems to have changed. Does that seem kind of weird?
For some theologies.
Miraculous.
Miraculous? Yeah, of course. But it seems kind of weird. He's died. He's in a place in suffering. It doesn't say he's in hell. It doesn't specifically say anything like that. But he says that he was in a place of suffering, and now he's in a place of rest, rejuvenation, however we would put it. And his wound is healed. So there's a lot probably to unpack here. I don't necessarily want to delve into that too much, but something to think about that, yes, our prayers for, we pray for the dead. We do it all the time. You might not know this, but at the rear of the altar table, we have all the names of everyone who has passed away at St. Spiridon. We haven't been here that long, and we're a young community, so it's not a big list. But every liturgy, after the consecration, the deacon goes to the back with the censer, and we cense in the back, and we read all those names of everybody's that's had a funeral here at St. Spiridon. And not only that, but we read the names of the person who brought the loaf for that day. So when you bring the prospero loaf to offer to be made into the body and blood of Christ, you bring names for the living and the dead, and we commemorate those names during the service of preparation, and then also the names of the dead during the liturgy as well. So we always commemorate and remember the dead. Not that they're sleeping, not that they're gone, they're not part of our lives anymore, but that we still have, an active relationship with them. And we wouldn't say that we have the power to change the ultimate result of, someone's salvation, but we always pray for someone's salvation, even after they've died. Because one thing we know is that God can change his mind. Right? We know this from the Old Testament. God goes to destroy, what city is it? No, not Nineveh. Is it Sodom?
Sure.
And then Abraham says, no, hold on. What if there's only 5 righteous people or 10 righteous people there? And he goes, okay, if there's 10 righteous people, I won't destroy it. And then Abraham's like, what about if there's only 5 righteous people there? And he goes, okay, if there's 5, what if there's only 1 righteous person there? If there's only 1 righteous person there, I won't destroy it. So, you can say what you want, but it seems like Abraham changes God's mind, right? God, we're not slaves. We are an active participants in the salvation of the world. And so our prayers, even for those who have passed away, avail much. They are of value. So we never cease praying. And again, I don't want to get into too much of the theology of that, but I think this message here from Perpetua is very appropriate to say, you keep praying, even for those who have passed away. Because you love them and you still desire for their salvation, regardless of what happened when they were alive. I forget, there was a recent saint who said, we can't preach universal salvation. You know what universal salvation is? Therefore, everybody is saved regardless of whether they want it or not. We can't preach universal salvation, but we can pray for it. So we can pray for everyone to be saved. We can't teach that it will happen, but we can pray that God would save everybody. Because even the loss of a single soul is tragic. And so we do pray for that. We pray for it all the time. Was there a... Yeah.
So the church would teach that God can change his mind.
I mean, I think yes. I think the answer is yes. And it's not that we teach it, it's biblical, right?
Totally.
Yeah.
There was always a debate of what those passages actually meant. If
Yeah.
God actually
Well, I think,
already changed his
you
mind.
know, I think, yeah, I wouldn't even get into those kinds of, oh, well, he knew that Abraham wasn't going to do that, so he just has this That's like almost trickery in a way for it to be that case. God is in relationship with his creation, right? He's not a bulldozer that just pushes everything out of the way and says, this is what's going to happen. I think of like the transfiguration. When Christ is transfigured in the mountain, who appears with him? Moses and Elijah. Why?
To represent the law and the prophets.
Not only that,
Yeah, but the bodies.
Moses changed his mind when he was going to kill them all and make the chosen people out of Moses instead of the people.
yes,
Moses said, don't do this.
right? There's another instance of him changing his mind. And why else? Why does Christ have this conversation with Moses and Elijah?
Discussing his departure.
He's discussing what he's about to do. He's about to go to his crucifixion, and he's actually having a conversation with Moses and Elijah. Not just as, the representation is important, but to be like in dialogue, essentially, with his creation. Does he force himself on Mary?
No.
He asks Mary. Right? So we actively participate in salvation with God. We're not just onlookers. We're not just, minions or lemmings that follow along on our little path. But instead, we actively participate in salvation.
Which really fits
It
in.
says, hey, they're running out of wine. It's not my time. He tells you.
There you go. So there's so many of these instances that God winds up changing his mind from his original plan. And, a loving God who wants to be in relationship, it makes sense, right? I mean, if you marry somebody and they're like, nope, I've got it figured out, you just fall in line, that wouldn't work, right? I mean, even if you say, even if you're right, Father Evan likes to say, you can be right or you can be in relationship. That's a Father Evan line. You can be right or you can be in relationship. And, God wants to be in relationship with us. There's this great other story. One of my friends, his spiritual father, he went up to him and he said, Father, I'd really like to go on this 6-week vacation. And during this time, I won't be able to go to church. Is that okay? And the spiritual father's like, if you think it'll be okay, then you can do that. And he winds up going and being away from church for 6 weeks, and he has almost this terrible experience, not because of the vacation itself, but just from his time away from the church. And he comes back and he goes, why didn't you tell me not to go? Or why didn't you tell me go to church or do these other things? Well, because if I had told you, you would have felt compelled or you would have felt forced, and then you would have held it against me or whatever. The only way that I could do is to let you go. And that always makes me also think of the story of the prodigal son. He goes to his father and he says, give me half of your wealth. Give me my inheritance. And does the father say anything? Take it and go. Because we're given freedom, right? That's not what he willed for his son, but he was given freedom and then invited him back when he knew he would come. So, sorry, we're digressing a little bit here, but
I just wanted to say that most of the prayers that we say include the word us and our Father. He's the Father of everybody.
mm-hmm.
And so we're always praying for, not myself, but,
the whole world.
and that's why the words us and our are used so much.
Yeah, it's great. I thought I saw another.
I was just going to say that the idea of changing God's mind, if that's really what it is, actually fits in with the whole notion of a prophet in the Old Testament. It's not like, I'll show you the future. It's always conditional. Here's the message. You should do this.
Yeah.
You don't. But it's always conditional, and there's always the chance, if you do what you're supposed to do, mercy is available.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's not like, here's the future, it's unalterable, there you go.
Right. Yeah. That's good. Okay. All right, so yeah, really, really interesting aside there. Like I said, on Vinokratis, and there's lots of other visions that she has. She has this vision of the actual day in the arena, and then and after the story of Perpetua, then we also have this very small first-person diary by Saturnus. And Saturnus, really, his contribution is a vision that he has. And that's a vision of, dying and then being taken to heaven by a host of angels. And it's really interesting, when they arrive in heaven, some of the angels actually are afraid of them. Did you catch that? I thought that was really interesting, that, the angels are afraid of these martyrs, not from a self-preservation standpoint, but like a fear of awe. That's how it should be understood. Like this great sacrifice that these martyrs had given, and even the angels are in awe of that. So that's a pretty neat little line that we have there from Saturnus. Yeah. Should we keep going? Okay. So I actually wanted to highlight this. There's this one vision that Perpetua has of her fight. And within that fight, she actually becomes a man.
I was like, did she mean that I'm a man? Or I was confused by that as well. Like,
Yeah, any thoughts?
Is it because they dressed her in a certain way?
No, they wind up dressing her in like a gown.
Right.
Yeah.
But this is a vision.
Vision. It's a vision that she has, yeah.
Well, in the vision, I thought it had said something about they had put some clothes on her, did something, and then she was a man.
Yeah.
I was like, did she mean she really was a man?
Yeah. Any thoughts on that? This isn't wokeness.
I thought they were putting armor on her to make her fight like a gladiator.
Yeah.
And that wasn't what she wanted to do. She wasn't going to fight. She was going to submit.
Okay. I actually had another thought on
Well,
it.
in the vision, suddenly I was a man. My seconds began to rub me down with oil. This is just what you do, like
Right, the gladiators, yep.
all that fun stuff like that. She's given this promise: if this Egyptian defeats her, he will slay her with a sword. If she defeats him, she will receive this branch, and this great figure withdraws here. I guess I was just looking at this. It doesn't matter who you are. If you are a Christian, you have the ability to fight the devil.
Mm-hmm.
You can go into combat just like anybody else.
Yeah,
Was that
Armor of God, maybe.
the Egyptian,
armor of God.
The Egyptian represented the devil. Was that?
Yeah, so anytime we hear like Egyptian, very oftentimes it's going to have Old Testament reference to Pharaoh and Pharaoh being evil. Yeah, and then there's a lot of imagery there. She receives the branch. What's the branch? Cross. A lot of times when we see branch, she's going to take up her cross, and then she receives the branch from who? Her trainer, who is Christ. So she takes up her cross from Christ, and then she goes toward the gate of life. So we have in here this little story of crucifixion and resurrection. So you take up your cross, you follow Christ, and through that is the resurrection. Kind of in those little lines there. Now, what I kind of took from her becoming a man is maybe a little bit more historical. In that when people said that they were when they become a man, they really were speaking about the manly virtues. And when I say this, I say things like, courage and strength. And these aren't to be genderized in the way that we would do so now, and that women can't be these things, but that these were what would be called the manly virtues, whereas the womanly virtues, would be compassion, kindness, these kinds of virtues. And so the virtues were separated out according to the manly and the womanly virtues. So in order to undergo this, the courage and the strength needed, she took on the manly virtues. And this kind of trope is used a couple of times in other martyr stories. So that would be my reading of it. Again, just within that historical context. And, it's important for us, of course, to not look negatively on separating out the virtues in that way. This is not a gender discussion, but just, being able to recognize certain virtues as being manly virtues and then the other virtues as being womanly virtues. And that's fine, right? And so that was my understanding, that when she underwent the martyrdom, she had to take on these manly virtues. Does that make sense? Okay. And then it's great. What does she do? She puts the Egyptian in a headlock. She does. She grabs her fingers together and wraps them around his head. So she gets him into a headlock and then stomps on his head, which is a reference to Genesis, right? Trample the serpent's head. So headlock and then stomps on his head. This is in the vision after he passes out. And then from that, she receives the cross from Christ and goes to resurrection. So that's kind of her last vision before the fight. And and then after that, so that's the end of the narrative by the first person narrative by Perpetua. And then we get into this short narrative by Saturnus, which we already spoke briefly about. This story really takes place after the martyrdom, right? So they're going into heaven, they're being escorted into heaven, and in heaven they hear the thrice holy hymn, right? The holy, 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 and, they're in the garden, and all of these kind of, details afterwards are put into place. So again, remember, we're putting in this context of the faithful, right, who are hearing this, and then the non-believers. So Perpetua is kind of giving us the side of the story of the martyrdom itself and how to approach it. And then Saturnus' side of the story is kind of, well, what is the result of this? So again, to give strength to people who might be undergoing a martyrdom more unwillingly. And then from that, we kind of enter into this, epilogue by the editor, who then tells the account of the martyrdom from a third person point of view, or somebody witnessing the event. And right before, after Saturnus, we hear the story of Felicitas, which again is really, really interesting. She's 8 months pregnant, and she's sad because she can't be martyred along with her friends. And that she has to wait for another month before giving birth and then being martyred. This is not really the comment of most pregnant women or new mothers. Perpetua had a breastfeeding infant, right? She was breastfeeding her infant, and she was seeking this type of martyrdom as well. And so all of her friends were sad, and they decided to come together, pray together, and she has the baby a month early. And so then she can be martyred. So it all just seems, again, extreme, right? So much different than what we would think is a life in the church and choices that we would make, right? Very, very different. But again, there is a place for it. Okay. We good?
I guess I was just sitting and thinking about how the way she's describing her martyrdom as a battle, because I guess for some reason I have this thought, like when someone decides to martyr themselves, there's no conflict or there's no internal battle going on, that they're just like, I'm so ready for this.
Yes.
And so it's interesting to hear that even though she was so ready, that there was still an internal battle going on, that she fought and won, but still that there was one. Yes,
and it's really heavily emphasized within her visions, and I think there's something really powerful there in that she's at peace with her decision, but doubts linger until the end, and the demons aren't going to stop assailing us. And again, the context of other people are reading this and going to be experiencing this. That's what's important, right? Imagine if you're reading a story from somebody who's in a similar situation from you, and they just handled it gallantly and nothing was ever wrong. That's going to make you doubt yourself even more. But when somebody goes through these struggles and they struggled with it, then that emboldens and strengthens you even more. Right? So I think, again, it's necessary for those reading it. Those people reading it. Justin?
I don't think it should go unnoticed that we're talking about two women in a world where women are considered chattel. Not in the church.
Sure.
But in the wider world, and by women, by being in the church and being Christian, we're elevated to a certain point where even in martyrdom, they were on a level playing field with the other men who were martyred, but they were not going to be dismissed as nothing. They were going to demand the same treatment in the wider world.
Right.
Even with children,
right.
The experience of a woman in that world. I think that's a fairly strong, important story to not. They're not just martyrs. These are women.
Women martyrs with newborns.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's amazing. Alex?
I noticed that when we read through the daily readings about different saints, and they'll be martyred in some way, you've got the Apollo or something else. He said, they defeated, they won, they triumphed, and they died. You're thinking, oh, okay, winning is losing. In that sense of you weren't defeated, you didn't give in, you didn't betray,
right,
and give up. And therefore you beat the emperor. You were victorious.
right.
It's a whole inverted set of values.
Right, and that's why we also speak about the crown of martyrdom. Right, they are crowned and they're recognized in that way. Yeah, that's great. Paul?
Yeah, I was curious about the state of mind at the point of being martyred. Were a lot of them, like peace or kind of an ecstasy? I mean, was that witnessed?
That's often how it's portrayed. Yes, that they are in this point of ecstasy. I forget the exact.
In the one part, she's trampled by the cow or whatever it was,
And she didn't even realize it.
She's like, they bring her back, and she's like, "Is it time to go face the animal?"
Yeah.
What are you talking about? Like, you were just out there.
Yeah, no, oftentimes they are in this place of ecstasy of experiencing the pain, but not in the same way. Because I think it does say at one point that she cries out. And in other martyr stories, it's very, very similar that, she looked as if she were no longer present in the body. So it's very common, in this story we see it, but in a lot of the stories of the martyrs, we see something very, very similar. And then if you read any of, just the short stories of the martyrs, they underwent horrific things. Another famous one is St. Catherine. St. Catherine was put on the wheel. And if you know the wheel, it's exactly what it sounds like. It's a big wooden wheel, and they would roll them on it, and they would, break every bone in their body. It was really a horrific way to kill someone, and did so joyfully. Just, unbelievable. But that's the grace of God that works through the martyrs, and this isn't something that's just been glossed over and covered by a few authors. It happens again and again and again and again, and witnessed by many, many people. Not just in one or two instances. So it's something real, and the grace of God that shines through these saints of the church. Yeah, it's amazing.
Dean Nicholas, I'm still having, I don't know, it might just be a journey for me. Like, I can't get my head around, like, there's not a right way to live and, like, your faith out. So,
right.
You have a baby, you have a responsibility to take care of that baby.
Right.
And it's how I've, handled other stories. There's some missionary in Africa that I would hear stories about, but his whole family ended up walking away from God because he just pretty much abandoned them in order to be a missionary in Africa.
Right.
And I remember we'd have conversations about that was the wrong decision. But in this case, it sounds like there's many doors. You just take the door that's presented to you. I can't get my head around it.
Yeah, no, there's there's an element of mystery that we can't get our heads around. And, like I said at the beginning, we are not supposed to do this. There are very, very few people who are supposed to do this. And, we don't know. I'm sure there was a community, right, that was there. And I'm sure their children weren't just, put on a doorstep. They were going to be cared for by the community. And yet it was more important for them to be martyred than to have been there to raise their children. Yeah. And that's a really hard and difficult thing to come to grips with.
Wasn't the crowd dismayed that they have a new mother out there?
Yeah, it does say that because it was clear that Felicitas had just given birth. And they said that she would be baptized twice in her own blood. Once in the blood of her birth, and then once in the blood of her martyrdom. So yeah, there's no answer.
Does the church, did the church not wrestle with these things? Does it wrestle with these things? How does the?
I think that's what we're doing.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't mean to be simple about it, but I think that's part of it. In that we don't have definitive answers. I spoke at the beginning about St. Theodore of Sicyon, who locked himself in an iron cage in the winter, and his feet, the skin ripped off the bottom of his feet. He did that to himself. Yeah. He locked himself in a cage. And very recently, I can't remember his name. He was a Russian saint. He was married. And he decided he didn't want to be married, and he left his wife. This was 100 years ago. And he's a saint of the church. Left his wife. And I think I've spoken to you maybe before about St. Constantine, right? If you're Protestant, what do you think about St. Constantine?
Oh, he's the one that ruined it.
He's the one that ruined the church. I remember somebody started coming to St. Spiridon, this was over 10 years ago, and he said, St. Constantine, killed his son. Yeah. Killed lots of people. Yeah. Did all these horrific things. Yep. And he's a saint of the church? Yep. Why? Because the church says that he's a saint. And there comes a point where, human logic has to go out the door, and we have to say, God is wondrous in his saints. And, all of these paths are open, and there's not just a formula. And it is a struggle. And I think the important thing is to live in that struggle and not to just want the solution. Yeah. Right? Because orthodoxy is hard. Right? And it's kind of like living in that difficulty and that tension that makes it more alive. It's like marriage. Right? If everything in marriage were easy, then you'd probably be a little bit suspicious. I mean, in a way, right? It's like going through those struggles and those tensions and coming out the other side stronger that really almost makes it worth living. I remember when I first moved out to Colorado, this is a little aside, just personal. I had a full-time job as an engineer. I was making lots of money, and I had no responsibilities, and I went up to the mountains every weekend, and it was fabulous. Fabulous. I mean, I loved it. And, after that, after several years, I wound up going to Holy Cross, and I went from, making lots of money to making no money. I lived in my own house with a quarter acre and all my stuff to living in a dorm room next to an 18-year-old. And there was an aspect of it that I was kind of miserable with, right? Kind of going from all this stuff to, all this humbling, that I was undergoing. And then at the same time, I remember talking to a friend back home and being like, there's something about this that makes it feel more freeing to me. Because before it was all self-gratification, and now it's okay, now I'm bound to this thing in a way. And in being bound, I'm feeling almost greater freedom. It was a weird experience. And, you experience that going into any relationship, right? You stop giving up your will in order to, bend your will to somebody else. And then that's kind of where we become more alive. And so, but it's tension, right? And we experience that tension in the church all the time, like in these kinds of stories, in our relationships, in our community, and it's really hard. But it's also life-giving too, in a way. I don't know. It's a mystery. It's a paradox, being in the church. I'm always just like, if everything is fine and dandy, that's when you should probably be a little bit worried. I mean, you know what I'm saying? Yeah.
I don't know if we're near the end or not, but I'm reminded of two books. One was the Confessions of St. Augustine, where he talks about a young man he knew who was a Christian, and his friends wanted him to go to the Colosseum to watch the games. And he said, I think I should, because they're so violent but entrancing. So finally he goes and he won't look during the violent parts, and finally he looks and he can't not look. He's totally enthralled because the nature of the violence is so enthralling. They're testifying to that was entertainment. It's in the movie Are You Not Entertained? And I think of the second book by Tom Holland, Dominion. Have you heard of it? He, non-Christian, raised in a Christian household, historian who traces the history of Christianity and how, through the endurance of the saints, he would say that, in a horribly preternatural, cruel world. Crucifix is just one example of it. The saints endure. Christianity becomes civilization. It civilizes. And now we have, he says, we can follow our whole concept of the value of the individual and human rights. All descends from Christianity. It didn't just happen because we evolved into it. There are reasons for that. And so the endurance of the saints, in one sense, sort of sanctifies civilization, at least in the West. We can see that's his argument there. And I would just think that is the long-term benefits of enduring. If they had not, if they sought to keep their own lives safe, and they kept their confession pure, it changed history.
Yeah. The church was really, founded on the life of the martyrs. In the first 300 years of the church, the saints of the church were the martyrs of the church. And, even to this day, you might not know this, but whenever an altar is consecrated, well, back in the early church, when they were performing liturgies, they would do it on the tombs of martyrs. Right? So very much a witness of realizing that the church was founded on the martyrs, and so the liturgy was done on the tombs of martyrs. And so now when a church is consecrated, we actually always put relics of martyrs into the altar. So every Orthodox church, inside of the altar, there are relics from a martyr that are present within that altar. Recognizing, again, that fact that the church is founded on the blood of the martyrs. And they provided this firm foundation of faith for the people before it had been regularized, right?
Who decides that, and where do they get them from?
All of like the Greek churches receive their relics from the Patriarchate in Constantinople. So I was at a consecration just a few weeks ago in Texas, and somebody brought them from Constantinople. And one of the saints was Saint Charalambos, who was an early martyr of the church.
And who's here?
I don't remember. Our altar is really interesting because it was not our church is not consecrated. The altar actually came from another church that was up in Wyoming. And that altar was consecrated in Wyoming. So we have a consecrated altar, but not a consecrated church. So I'm actually kind of curious what they're going to do when we actually consecrate the church. Because the altar itself, like I said, maybe we'll get a new altar and that will go into a side altar. That's my guess. But I have no idea. Yeah.
Is that because the church isn't paid for yet? So
Yes and no. Typically, bishops like to wait until the church is paid for.
I
So,
was gonna say that's when we were up at the monastery yesterday. That's what Deacon Martin was saying, was that they haven't consecrated it yet because we haven't fully paid for it.
that's typically because they don't want to consecrate a church that might not stay as a church. Because it's a big deal to like deconsecrate a church. So they usually wait for the church to be completely paid for and self-sustaining before they actually do the consecration. We should have it paid off by November, right? That's the goal. I think we'll do it. So maybe next year we'll have a consecration. Yeah. It's a really beautiful service.
I was gonna say, I heard from Mother Cassiana that that's a very, very lengthy and very beautiful service.
It is definitely very lengthy. We'll be sure not to do it in the summer because you're out. You process around the church 3 times and you're outside for like 45 minutes.
I thought Bishop Isaiah was here, and I thought this building was consecrated.
No, we did the opening. So we opened the doors. So there's the service of the opening of the doors, which we did.
Thank you.
Yeah, which is different from the consecration.
Okay. Wow.
Yeah.
Glad I came.
We're Orthodox. We've got a service for everything. Like, you can't even open the doors without a service. Yeah. Well, great.
Thank you.
Well, I hope you enjoyed this reading. I think it's really it's a fantastic one. It raises lots and lots of questions. Good. It's not just, a clear, straightforward martyrdom story, but it kind of brings in a lot of different topics, which I think is fabulous. 2 weeks. I'm out of town next week. In 2 weeks, we're going to finish up with a story of 2 modern saints, St. Gabriel, again, of Georgia, and St. Porphyrios of Kavzukalivia. And these stories are going to be much, much different. They're very recent saints, and the stories are not polished at all. They're going to read like your next-door neighbor wrote about it, about their best friend. So, don't look for, heavy literature here. Instead, much, much more recent, and it makes it very endearing, actually. Imagine if you knew somebody and you realized they were a saint, you weren't a good writer, but you just I just have to tell this person's story. That's how these are written. And actually, the one about St. Gabriel is probably a recent, not great translation as well. So you have, somebody, an uneducated writer, translated by somebody into English, and so the translation's not fantastic probably either. But the highlight there is to realize again that saints are a living reality, and they're still being produced all around us. And so I'm looking forward to reading those last 2 lives, and we'll wrap this class up. Thank you.